Princess Zara, royal heir to the Exeltronian Empire, had everything that anyone could ever dream of. Her beauty was unmatched, her intellect unmatched, and her power? Well, that was so far beyond any other species in the galaxy that even the most powerful kings, princes, and lords were nothing more than pawns at her feet. Yet, despite her vast fortune and overwhelming allure, Zara had one problem: no suitor could meet her standards. She had rejected countless beings, from the proud to the humble, from the powerful to the meek. Not a single one could satisfy her, no matter how impressive they were. It wasn't even about looks. Of course, Zara was stunning, an alien beauty of celestial proportions. But it wasn't just her appearance that kept suitors at bay. It was her insane expectations. If a potential partner couldn't match her intellectually, emotionally, and above all, physically, she sent them packing with little more than a polite bow. The last suitor, a large and powerful Galician general, had been deemed too loud in the bedroom and too soft in the mind, before being unceremoniously sent away with a flick of her fingers. None of them could ever reach her. No one could meet her lofty standards. As her throne room continued to echo with the sounds of rejection, she found herself growing increasingly disillusioned with the entire process. What's wrong with everyone? I can't even find someone who knows how to tie their own shoes. Zara muttered to herself as she gazed out the window of her expansive royal palace, her mind wandering to far-off places. The stars, the endless void outside her grand palace, seemed to be mocking her. If anyone knew how to fix what was broken in her heart, they hadn't yet appeared. Zara let out a deep sigh as she leaned back into her velvet throne, every inch of her regal being aching from the exhausting task of rejecting one suitor after another. She had come to a conclusion. Perhaps it was her royal status that kept the right kind of suitor away. Who could possibly stand up to someone as perfect as she? Perhaps it was her fault for expecting too much, but that didn't make the disappointment any easier to swallow. Still, she refused to settle. Every being that failed to meet her standards was simply not worth her time. As the stars twinkled outside, she stared out into the void, contemplating the possibility that she might live out her days alone. Maybe the universe had other plans, but none of those plans seemed to include finding someone who could satisfy her needs. But then, the unthinkable happened. From the corner of her eye, she saw a flicker of movement in the deep expanse of space. Her royal palace's sensors beeped to life. Something was coming. Something that didn't match any ship known to the Exeltronian Empire. Zara's brow furrowed as she looked at the monitor. There, on the screen, was a strange, disheveled vessel that seemed barely capable of holding itself together. It was small, clunky, and held together by what appeared to be duct tape. What in the galaxy? Zara muttered under her breath, eyeing the screen with growing intrigue. The human ship was unlike anything she had ever seen. It wasn't sleek like an Exeltronian warship or imposing like the Galician fleet. This ship looked like it had been cobbled together by someone who didn't know the first thing about starship engineering. This must be a mistake, Zara thought. Her mind raced as she realized that this vessel, this unsophisticated, messy piece of machinery, was heading straight for her palace. With the press of a button, her royal advisors flooded into the room. Princess, there's an unknown vessel approaching. Its structure doesn't match any known species or ship design, one of her advisors explained. I can see that, Zara replied sharply, her curiosity piqued. But what is it? Is it dangerous? Her advisor hesitated. It's human. The word hung in the air like an unfamiliar spice, and Zara raised an eyebrow. Human? But they don't have the technology for something like this. She took another look at the ship on the screen. The human vessel continued its journey toward her. I want to meet them, she said, her voice low, almost amused by the audacity of this human who was brave, or foolish, enough to approach her. And then, the unthinkable happened. The human ship landed outside her palace, and Zara's curiosity turned to something else entirely, something more like disbelief. The ship's hatch opened with a grinding whine, and out stepped a man who looked nothing like the dignitaries she was used to. He was a human, a tall one, dressed in a torn jumpsuit with grease stains all over it. He didn't even have the courtesy to look nervous, as Zara would have expected any proper envoy to act when standing before such royalty. Instead, he looked completely unbothered, like he had no idea what he was getting into. Is this a joke? Zara thought, her voice steady but growing increasingly incredulous. She observed the human carefully. His hair was messy, his face covered in stubble, and his posture was that of someone who had never been told how to behave properly in the presence of royalty. This was no dignitary, no skilled diplomat from a neighboring empire. This man wasn't here to impress her, and he didn't seem to care about making a good impression at all. He didn't even look the slightest bit intimidated by her throne or her beauty. Well, now I've seen everything, Zara thought dryly, still watching him with a mix of fascination and disbelief. Jake, as it turned out, was Captain Jake, an intergalactic mechanic who had no idea he was about to meet a princess. He had come to fix the ship that had brought him to Zara's planet, not to fall into the trap of political games or societal expectations. All he knew was that his ship was on the fritz, and it had to be fixed. That, of course, was when things started to get interesting, and highly comedic. Captain Jake stepped out of his ship, breathing in the unfamiliar air of an alien world. The moment his boots hit the ground, he noticed the enormous, grand palace looming in front of him. He blinked and scratched the back of his head. The structure was magnificent, but there was something strange about it, a sense of importance that made him feel out of place. He sighed, looking back at the rickety vessel he'd arrived in. It was practically held together by duct tape and wishful thinking. Well, guess this is my grand entrance, Jake muttered to himself. His ship had definitely seen better days, but he was no engineer. He was a mechanic. He could fix things, or at least he hoped he could. Approaching the palace, Jake tugged at his jumpsuit, making sure it wasn't too wrinkled, though, at this point, what difference would it make? He had a feeling the last thing the people here were concerned about was his attire. The doors to the palace opened automatically as he neared, and there, standing before him, was a woman who could only be described as a goddess. Her figure was regal, her eyes piercing, and she was surrounded by attendants who seemed to hang on her every word. Jake's mouth went dry. Hi, he said, his voice cracking slightly. I'm here to fix your ship? The princess's gaze didn't waver. Her expression was one of indifference, but there was a glimmer of something, curiosity, maybe? She studied him for a long moment. Jake awkwardly shifted his weight from one foot to the other, unsure whether he should bow, introduce himself, or just offer her a handshake. Nothing in his training prepared him for this. I see, she said finally, her voice low and commanding. You're the human mechanic. Her tone wasn't impressed, more like she was stating a fact she couldn't quite believe. And you're here to fix what is broken. Jake paused. Yeah, that's the plan. I'm not sure how much I can do with duct tape and all this fancy alien tech, but I can certainly give it a go. He motioned to the tools he carried with him, the usual assortment of wrenches and screwdrivers. His eyes caught the sight of the princess's sharp gaze, and he cleared his throat. You know, I've fixed some pretty bad ships before, so this might be a walk in the park. The princess raised an eyebrow. A walk in the park? You fix things? Jake, clueless to the hidden meaning, gave a confident grin. You bet. I'm the best at it. I'm basically the go-to guy for anything that's broken. Zara's eyes twinkled with interest. Anything you say? Anything, Jake responded, still oblivious to the suggestive undertones in her voice. He continued, I've fixed everything from engines to broken hearts. Though, I'm guessing you've got a bigger issue than just the ship's systems. The princess's lips twitched. A broken heart, you say? Jake blinked, unaware of the implications. Yeah, it's a metaphor. But hey, if you've got a busted emotional system, I might be able to help with that too. You'd be surprised what a few adjustments and some elbow grease can do. Zara took a step closer, her gaze intense. So, you believe you can fix what's wrong with me, human? Jake chuckled, adjusting his toolkit. Well, I wasn't going to mention it, But you do seem like someone who could use a little fixing. Nothing a little mechanical ingenuity can't handle, right? The princess smiled, but it was a smile laced with both amusement and challenge. You think you can fix me, mechanic? Jake nodded confidently. I can fix just about anything. Just let me take a look at your ship, and we'll see what needs to be done. I'm not sure what exactly you're referring to when you say fixing, but I can assure you, I'm very good with my hands. The princess tilted her head, her smile turning sly. Are you now? Well, we'll see just how good you are, human. For now, we'll begin with your first task, fix my ship. Jake's face softened as he processed the gravity of her words. Right? Sure. I'll get to it immediately. You don't mind if I get a little greasy, do you? He asked, gesturing to his already worn-out jumpsuit. She laughed lightly, almost as if she found his awkwardness endearing. Greasy? I think you'll be more than fine, mechanic. As Jake made his way toward the ship, he glanced back at the princess, still unsure of what exactly was happening. Something about her felt different. Not the way he'd expected a princess to be, distant, cold, aloof. Instead, she was so direct, so unbothered by formalities. It was like she was testing him, seeing if he'd crumble under the pressure, or if he would rise to meet her challenge. He knelt down next to the ship, unpacking his toolkit and starting his assessment. All right, let's see what we're working with here. He pulled open a panel, revealing a jumble of wires and outdated components. Wow, this is a mess. Zara observed silently from a distance, her curiosity growing. There was something strangely alluring about this human. His boldness, his confidence, the way he didn't bow or grovel in the presence of royalty. It was almost refreshing. She couldn't help but admire it, even if she didn't show it on the outside. So tell me, mechanic, she said after a pause, what's it like to be so uninhibited? Do humans not have the same need for structure that we do? Jake didn't look up from his work as he spoke. We have structure, sure. But we also have a lot of flexibility. Some things can't be fixed with rules alone, you know? Really? Zara raised an eyebrow. And what exactly is it that you think can't be fixed with rules? Jake paused, pulling at a stubborn bolt. People mostly. You can't always fix them with a set of instructions or regulations. Sometimes it just takes a little bit of, well, ingenuity. There was a beat of silence before the princess's voice broke through again, softer now, almost thoughtful. I see. Perhaps there is more to your kind than I originally thought. Jake, oblivious to the deeper meaning behind her words, simply smiled. Yeah, we've got our ways. Trust me, you've never met a species like ours. And as the two of them stood there, the beginning of something unexpected was taking shape. Neither of them could have predicted where it would lead, but in that moment, something shifted. Jake was fixing the ship, but in a way, he was also fixing something else, something he wasn't quite aware of yet. Jake worked tirelessly, sweat dripping down his forehead as he tightened screws, replaced wires, and patched up the holes in the ship's hull. The ship was a mess, but it was a mess he knew how to fix. As he worked, he could feel the princess's gaze on him, sharp and intense, studying his every move. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was definitely a little distracting. She hadn't said much since their first exchange, and that only made Jake more aware of her presence. He tried to ignore it, focusing on the ship, but every now and then, he'd glance up, only to find her watching him with an unreadable expression. So, he finally said, breaking the silence, you never really told me what exactly you need fixed on this thing. I mean, other than the obvious. He gestured to the ship, half broken, with wires sticking out like a tangled mess. Zara tilted her head slightly, eyes never leaving him. The ship's systems are only part of the problem. I need someone who can fix what's broken inside. Her voice was smooth, measured, but there was an underlying intensity that made the words hang in the air, heavy with implication. Jake's hand paused mid-motion. He looked up at her, confusion flickering across his face. What do you mean, inside? He asked, genuinely puzzled. Zara's lips curled into a small, almost amused smile. I've had countless suitors, human. Kings, diplomats, warriors, none of them could fix what's wrong with me. Jake blinked, still not fully understanding. Well, you're pretty impressive. Maybe they just didn't know what they were dealing with. Zara's gaze softened ever so slightly. Maybe, she said, her voice almost playful. But I wonder if you'll be different. Humans are known for their ingenuity. Jake shrugged, trying to stay casual, though a tinge of awkwardness crept into his voice. I mean, I can fix a ship, but people? I'm not so sure about that. I just do what I do best. Her eyes never left him, and there was something in her expression that Jake couldn't quite place. You don't think you could fix someone like me? Her voice was low now, almost a challenge. Jake let out a nervous laugh, scratching the back of his neck. I mean, I guess it depends on what kind of fixing you need. Like, I can patch things up or… He stopped himself, realizing that he might have said something that sounded worse than intended. He cleared his throat. I can fix machines, not people. Not that you're a machine or anything. I mean, I'm sure you've got your own thing going on. Zara raised an eyebrow, clearly entertained by his discomfort. Do I now? She asked softly, her tone playful yet pointed. Jake was starting to feel like he was caught in a tangled mess of his own, unsure whether he was being flirted with or if he was just completely misreading the situation. He chose to focus on the ship again, trying to distract himself. Right, well, if we're talking about fixing the ship, I'll need some time. It's not just a quick patch job. I'm not interested in quick fixes, Zara said, her voice steady, her eyes never leaving his. Jake hesitated, unsure how to respond. Look, I'm here to get the ship working again. That's all. Anything else is… He trailed off, his words failing him. There was a tension in the air, something he couldn't quite grasp but was definitely there, thick and palpable. After a long pause, Zara stepped closer to him, closing the distance between them. You may be able to fix my ship, human. But what if there's something more that even your skills can't handle? Her voice had shifted again, and there was a glint of something in her eyes that made Jake feel like he was being drawn into a different kind of challenge. Jake swallowed hard, trying to make sense of her words. I guess we'll see, he said, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. Zara watched him for a moment longer, then turned her attention back to the ship. We'll see indeed. But be warned, mechanic. You may not be prepared for everything you'll find. Jake nodded, unsure whether he was in over his head, or just dealing with an alien princess who had a very odd way of making conversation. Either way, he wasn't about to back down. Just let me finish up the work, and we'll figure out the rest, he said, trying to sound more confident than he felt. Zara gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Very well. But know this, human. I've been told many things in my life, but no one has ever fixed what's wrong with me. Not until now. Jake shot her a confused glance, but before he could respond, she turned and walked away, her attendants following closely behind her. The weight of her words lingered in the air as he returned to his work, feeling the pressure building. As the hours passed, Jake continued to work on the ship, though his mind kept drifting back to the conversation. What had she meant? He had been trained to fix ships, to repair engines, but what if there was more to it? What if he had just stepped into a situation that required more than mechanical expertise? The idea that he could fix a princess, or anyone for that matter, seemed absurd. But then again, he couldn't help but wonder. Maybe she didn't mean it literally. Maybe she was just playing with him, teasing him, and he was too oblivious to catch on. But as the day wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that Zara was not like anyone he had ever met before. Her intelligence, her beauty, her challenge, it was all part of a puzzle he wasn't sure he could solve. And maybe, just maybe, that was the most intriguing thing about her. When he finally finished with the ship, Jake stepped back, wiped the grease from his hands, and took a long look at the results. The ship was, if not perfect, at least functional again. But something in the back of his mind told him that the real work, the work he wasn't sure he was ready for, was just beginning. And for the first time in a long while, he wasn't sure if he was going to be able to fix this one. Jake had finished the repairs on the ship, and to his surprise, it was actually running better than expected. The hum of the engines now sounded smoother, the lights brighter, and everything was functioning just as it should. He wiped his hands on his jumpsuit and took a step back, admiring his work. His chest puffed out a bit. "Not bad for a human mechanic," he muttered to himself, proud of what he had accomplished. But as the minutes passed, an unsettling feeling crept into his mind. He wasn't entirely sure what was happening with Zara. Since he'd arrived, their interactions had been confusing, laden with subtle remarks and undercurrents he hadn't fully understood. He had fixed her ship, sure. But what about the rest of the fixing she had hinted at? What was it she really wanted from him? Jake turned toward the palace and could see her figure moving in the distance, surrounded by her attendants. He tried to shake off the unease that gnawed at him. It wasn't like he was here for anything but mechanical work, right? But something about the way she spoke, the way she looked at him, made him think she wasn't just looking for someone to repair a ship. He had the distinct feeling he was being tested, though he had no clue in what way. Taking a deep breath, Jake decided to find out what exactly Zara expected of him. He wasn't going to let her intimidate him, no matter how beautiful or powerful she was. He made his way toward the princess, determined to face whatever challenge lay ahead. When he reached her, Zara was standing near the ship, her back straight, her posture regal as always. She didn't acknowledge him right away, but her eyes briefly flicked toward him, a glint of curiosity in her gaze. "I see the ship is operational again," she said, her voice smooth, but with a hint of something he couldn't quite decipher. "Yep, everything's running smoothly now," Jake said, trying to sound confident. "Didn't take as long as I thought. Looks like you've got yourself a solid piece of tech here, though I'm guessing you didn't get it this way." Zara's smile was small but knowing. "I didn't," she agreed, her eyes still locked on his. "It's good that you were able to fix it. But you do realize that there are other things that need fixing, don't you?" Jake blinked. Other things?" he repeated, unsure where this was going. "Yes," she said slowly, her gaze never leaving him. "Things that no mechanic can handle with wrenches and wires." Jake opened his mouth, but the words caught in his throat. Was she talking about what he thought she was talking about? His mind raced, but before he could respond, she took a step forward. The air between them grew thick with tension. "You don't have to pretend you don't understand," Zara continued, her voice soft but laced with something more dangerous now. "I know that humans have a certain way of solving problems. And I'm wondering if you can solve mine." Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. He had no idea what she was implying, but the implication was clear enough: she was testing him. He wasn't just here to fix his ship. He was here to fix something in her life that no one else had been able to. Was it her loneliness? Her emotional scars? Or was there something else entirely that he couldn't even begin to grasp? "You want me to fix something, in you?" Jake asked cautiously, trying to keep his voice steady. "Look, I'm just a mechanic. I fix ships, not people." He waved a hand, trying to indicate that this wasn't his area of expertise. "I don't know what kind of fixing you think you need, but I'm not that kind of guy." Zara's eyes flashed, but she didn't seem offended. Instead, she looked intrigued. "You don't have to be. But you've made it clear that you're good with your hands. Perhaps there's more you could do with them than you realize." Jake froze, his heart pounding in his chest. This was definitely not what he had expected when he boarded the ship to begin with. She was playing with him, pushing his buttons in ways he wasn't prepared for. He shifted uncomfortably, unsure of how to respond to the clearly suggestive undertones in her words. Before he could say anything, Zara took another step closer, her presence overwhelming. "You've fixed my ship, human. But now I wonder if you can fix me, really fix me." Jake took a quick step back, his mind racing. This was completely out of his depth. He was a mechanic, not some kind of emotional healer or relationship expert. He didn't know the first thing about dealing with a princess's personal issues. But the way she looked at him, the way she spoke, It was as if she expected him to be the one to save her from whatever had been weighing her down for so long. I don't know what you mean, Jake stammered, suddenly unsure of his own abilities. I can't fix you. I'm just a guy who fixes engines and ships. I can't fix feelings or whatever it is that's going on with you. Zara stepped closer, placing a hand on his shoulder with surprising gentleness. You'd be surprised at what you can fix, mechanic. Sometimes, all it takes is a little attention. A little time. And maybe, a little honesty. The sudden closeness of her touch made Jake's heart race. He wanted to pull away, to distance himself from whatever game she was playing, but there was something compelling about her. She wasn't just playing with him, she was challenging him, pushing him into a corner, testing his resolve. Honesty? Jake asked, his voice almost a whisper. What kind of honesty are we talking about here? Zara's gaze softened, her hand still resting on his shoulder, though her eyes were sharp with purpose. The kind where you admit that you can't fix everything with tools alone. That sometimes you have to be more than a mechanic. Sometimes you have to be a human. Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. There it was again, the shift in her tone, the words that seemed so simple but held so much weight. She wasn't talking about fixing the ship anymore. She was talking about something deeper. Something far more personal. Jake started, but the words wouldn't come. Don't worry, Zara said, her voice lowering as she stepped even closer. You may not understand everything now. But maybe, just maybe, you'll learn what it means to really fix something. Jake stood there, frozen. He had come to this palace thinking he was just fixing a ship, but now, he had no idea what he had stepped into. The tension between them was palpable, and he had no idea what Zara was asking from him, what she expected him to do. But one thing was certain, he wasn't just repairing a ship anymore. He was tangled in something far more complex than he could have imagined.